Today, we're on the Logistics Leadership Podcast, and I am very fortunate to be joined today by Rick Watson. Rick is the CEO and founder of RMW Commerce. Rick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Ben. So glad to be on the podcast.
Thanks for joining us. And before we get into the fun today, which is going to be a conversation about navigating uncertainty in supply chain, which I'm sure there's going to be plenty to talk about, let's talk about you a little bit. What is it that RMW Commerce does? What do you do?
Yeah, so RMW Commerce is a boutique e-commerce consulting firm. We help our customers with revenue creation and growth strategies. I mean, so obviously there are a lot of different players in the ecosystem, from vendors to system integrators. We sit on the side of the clients to help them achieve their business goals. And so really the intersection of people, process, technology, and the financial outcomes that you're going to create. Um, Kind of feels like it's so funny. I grew up in technology, and there's so many people that sort of go right to tech as a solution to every problem, but ultimately the business needs to use technology in support of people that are executing a plan. And so connecting what are your growth goals as a business, planning that next phase of growth, where is it going to come from, and how to optimize the business for success. That's what we focus on at RMW Commerce.
Great. Yeah, and that growth and planning focus was one of the reasons I thought you'd be perfect for this episode because you have to build plans against a future that's uncertain. And these days we're seeing much more in terms of the black swan events, whether that be something in the Red Sea, the ILA strike, or COVID as a whole over the last 5 years. But you touched on your experience prior to starting RMW Commerce, and eclectic, I think, was the best way I could describe it. You've been a little all over the map. So, in light of that, can you talk about what was the common thread running through that and why that prompted you to start this business?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I've always been fascinated by technology and really solving big challenges that lead to growth and opportunity for companies and organizations. Um, Initially, starting on more on the developer side, and I found that there are really sort of two aspects of my personality. One is solving sort of technical challenges, but then also working with business stakeholders and CEOs and investors on creating outcomes and creating what the future is going to be like is not just sort of creating a product and letting it go. It's like, how do you take it to how do you take it to market? How do you build a business and organization around it and help customers achieve that vision? And so my career has been starting literally as a software engineer at Channel Advisor back in 99 and spent 10 years there, kind of started my journey more to the business side during that time, but getting to see the creation of marketplaces like eBay and Amazon and really where that has kind of grown up in the world. Moved to New York City in about 2011 to run barnesandnoble.com's third-party marketplace division, so experience inside of a retailer, navigating the uncertainty of large companies and big projects and growth there. Was CEO of a software company in New York City that was venture-backed called, Merchantry, and kind of the drop shipping, supply chain, and marketplace space, and ended up selling that to a larger, startup based in Silicon Valley, and then spent some time in supply chain with Pitney Bowes. They had acquired Borderfree and also managed cross-border e-commerce for a number of, uh, quite a number of brands, several hundred, uh, tens of millions of cross-border parcel volume, particularly for US and UK firms that are looking to sell into 100 plus markets around the world. And so, kind of that intersection of customer experience, what does the buyer's experience look like in these countries that are shopping, payment processing, as well as supply chain delivery, reverse logistics. Those are all the things that I kind of helped them manage. I was running the product management group that was creating all the software that was used both in the facilities, which were cross-dock facilities based in the US primarily, as well as the buyer customer experience. And so I've always just loved e-commerce and the fact that it's so dynamic. And so that's certainly a common thread, is just staying in a space that I loved and seeing it from all aspects, from software company, um, inside of a retailer, service provider, and now as a consulting firm, I get a little bit different angle from it because I get to sit on the client side of the
Yeah.
table as they navigate these challenges. A lot of times, a client hires a service provider, and the service provider is like wondering, I wonder what's happening in the boardroom while they're thinking about this decision. They're like on the outside of it. As a consultant, one of my goals is to be on the client side of the table, which is one of the things I find most
Yeah,
fascinating.
as Aaron Burr said, being in the room where it happens, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, since we're talking uncertainty, and I did notice that e-commerce thread. I don't know if you want to talk about the general framework for how you think about uncertainty in a business context, or make that a little more narrow to e-commerce. Like, how should business leaders think about uncertainty in their business and planning against it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a super broad topic, so you need to think of a few different aspects to it. There's you can almost think about it from a market uncertainty, which is you obviously have everyone has a certain set of customers. So what is the likelihood that your customers are going to change their preferences, or how are your customers changing over time? Are they becoming more likely to buy your product or less likely to buy your product? And so I would call that kind of market uncertainty and put a number
Yeah.
of risks in that
Okay.
bucket. Second is I don't know, I mean, you should call this sort of like global and structural uncertainty. And so you end up with things like is the world a stable place, or is the world a politically uncertain
Right.
place? It kind of feels like if you go back 25, 30 years, every era, you think it's completely uncertain while you're in it, but then if you look back, you're like, "Actually, it's more stable than I remember compared to today." And so from a comparison point of view, um, if you kind of go back to the 80s, it was sort of US and Russia. And then since the breakup of the Soviet Union, we've been in an increasingly sort of multipolar world with lots of different forces. And the US is not necessarily the only dominant superpower in the world, which creates a lot of uncertainty in trading relationships. The notion of trading partners and trading relationships certainly affects supply chain and logistics in all sorts of ways, from tariffs and codes and uh, regulations and postal. And so there's a whole, like, I would say, trading and
Yeah.
political certainty that gets into sort of the supply chain and angle of it. And then, kind of more closer to home, you have a little bit business uncertainty, which is like, what's the likelihood that your you know your people will stay with you? Do you have stability in your workforce? For instance, if you're planning um, your employment and staffing for a distribution center for the holiday season, like as everyone has already kind of done at this point, what's the risk that you're going to wake up Monday morning and half your staff isn't going to show up? And do you need contingency from like a third party placement firm to get someone in that day if you need to get products out
Yeah.
the door? So that's kind of like, I think, people uncertainty at on the ground level, who are actually performing the tasks you need every day to service your customers, um, is another big risk that people are trying to remove from their businesses. Some cases with AI and robotics, some cases with automation, and some cases with backup plans and
Yeah.
contingencies.
Interesting. I mean, there's a lot I can unpack there. I'd start with, given the time you spend in these boardrooms, where do you seem to have to focus the most? Where's the most opportunity for these businesses to improve? Is it in that understanding of geopolitical risk? Is it in their people? Is it in the market? Where are companies lacking a plan or an understanding of the uncertainty?
I think a lot of it depends on where the businesses
Right.
come from. Are you in a turnaround mode, like as an investor? So I usually start from the investment angle, which is like, is this a recently capitalized business because there's new ownership? New ownership is likely to make new investments and wants to make a number of changes to improve the business in the next 3 to 5 years, say. If it's a business that's sort of more independently and self-funded, then cash flow is a much bigger concern, and so making big changes are more difficult, and so the business needs to be a little bit more kind of self-funding from that side. I think in the short term, you kind of go back to number one is like, what is the goal? Do you have financial projections for that goal? What are the assumptions in those financial projections? And then what are the risks to those assumptions? And so when you get down to the assumptions, for instance, like I need to procure these materials at this price from this location and this supplier. Well, if there's a trade war with that country, is there a risk that that supplier goes out of business or is unable to deliver that order? What does that affect to your
Right.
supply chain? Um, Ultimately, every line item and every spreadsheet that goes into your financial plans and your P&L projections and your vendors that are producing um, or delivering on that is a risk that needs to be managed. And so um, usually it's in a time of stability where there's we're not talking about like terrorist attack or Red Sea situation. The concerns are a little bit more closer to
Mm.
home, like, do we need to increase our advertising spend on Google or Facebook or something like that to get more people to the website? Or why are we getting so much traffic to our website and they're not converting? Or how do we make our customers happier with our products? Those are the risks to your plans. And then something like, I don't know, a global pandemic happens, and then your whole plan is essentially
Right.
worthless. So I think ultimately, look, you can AI or whatever all you want. There's nothing that could predict such a situation that doesn't require the whole company to just tear up every plan they've made in the past 5 years and replan for whatever the current
Right.
reality is. And so I like to have, in the face of that uncertainty, what's important is to have options for plans, which means plan A is like assuming that we're going to be in this situation for a while, meaning like, what if we don't discover a cure? I'm just going to go back like
Mm.
3 years. What if we don't discover a cure for COVID for like 5, 10 years? Like we could be just how we are. How would the business operate then? What if it gets better? What if it gets worse? And so, how do you come up with this sort of A, B, C planning cycles? And the goal is not to be correct, but to think thoughtfully about the future and how the business might react in these different
Yeah.
scenarios.
Yeah, well said there. And going back to what I like to refer to as the old codger effect, where you're saying there's more uncertainty today than there's ever been. We always think that, and then we realize that wasn't true. Um, so when you look at maybe geopolitical risk as one example, how do you differentiate kind of the animal spirits of uncertainty from like what is true risk from any perspective, geopolitical market? Are are there things that you're watching that other people should be watching to really quantify the risk register?
Yeah, I mean, some of it depends on where the risk is coming from. And so if you're looking at, I'm just going to use an example and not, I'm on no side of it, to be clear, but like we have an election cycle coming up. And so depending on who's elected and president and they have different staffs and different policies, the trading environment could be different, like what Section 321 does, what our policy is towards China and Taiwan or the UK or or the EU could be different. And so I think if there is a near-term cause for the risk that will allow you to evaluate your decision and sort of give you different outcomes if that happens. If those are fundamental to your business plan, then that's important. The other things are like, I'm just going to use an example. If you're a brand selling apparel and China is 30% of your revenue. I'm just going to use that example as another risk. Like China had a policy, a demographic policy over the last 30 years that just did not encourage people to have children. So as a result, like you have an incredibly aging population that's not being replaced as much, and so the chances are like population will continue to decline. It's not going to increase overnight regardless of a new policy. And so if your goal is growth, then even if you make your product a lot cheaper or you sell or you add a whole bunch of new products into China, like I'm just using this as an example, you're not going to create new people in China as a company, right? And so there could be, as a solution could be to diversify or to invest more in other markets in the next 5, 10 years, um, to smooth out maybe, revenue growth issues that you might be having or might experience as a result. And I think like luxury apparel has been really hit
Hmm.
by this in the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, I love the specific examples and industries. And, you know, you spoke to close to home is where things start. And I've seen that same risk not recognized by companies doing site selection for plants and warehouse, right? We've seen a lot of cases where big enterprises domestically place things where it is cheap to get power, cheap to get land, but there isn't a labor source available. And now companies are getting more sophisticated and building in their models labor availability and transit times from commute locations and things like that. Um, so that's an example of how companies are getting more sophisticated as we learn to deal with uncertainty. Talking to the last 5 years, and obviously COVID's a big high low light of that, I guess I'd say. But in terms of uncertainty, it allowed business leaders a chance to reset their how they plan and plan around uncertainty. So across the events, not talking the events as much themselves, but the responsiveness of enterprise. What have you seen in terms of enterprises thinking about uncertainty differently in this new normal? And if you've got examples again, who are the winners in that space because they're acting differently?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Picking the winners is hard because there aren't like I would say in general, bigger companies have been more winners than smaller companies because um, it's easier for them to diversify than a smaller company that usually has to place a bet on one thing, and if it doesn't work out, it's hard to have like three backup plans. I'm just going to use an
Yeah,
example like UPS has been planning as an as for the past 5, 6 years of like Amazon is a big piece of our volume. We know that they're building their own massive logistics network. What do we do
right.
about it? And so the goal would be like, how do we maintain them as a customer or maintain some kind of volume, but build our own capabilities and plan to go into healthcare or invest into Mexico and shoring and increase our supply chain on that side. So that's one
So
example.
UPS, I want to plug on again because our listeners love UPS and Amazon and what's going on in that space. So would you say like they've definitely shown that they recognize it, the risk, the uncertainty associated with Amazon, and they are diversifying? But you also said, I'm not sure if we picked any winners. Do you think that's been successful for UPS? Do you think they're going in the right direction?
Look, I think here's what I like about UPS is what they're doing is they have a very thoughtful CEO in Carol Tomei that has read the room, looked at where the world is going, and advocating a specific strategy for where the
Right,
company goes. Meaning, like, we can't depend on US retail domestic volume to power the future similar to the last 10 years because Amazon and Walmart are getting all the growth and we're not going to be an end-to-end provider for these
right,
companies. Or the rest of the volume is coming from like Temu, Shein, TikTok Top, which, are postal last mile customers. They are growing customers of UPS now, but for how long and for what margin is the
right.
question. And so I think pivoting to healthcare makes sense. I think pivoting to Mexico makes sense because of Section 321 and sort of the tariff and other duties benefits to that is important. I think the company that has sort of let the future happen to them and sort of stuck their head in the sand a little bit has been FedEx. As a comparison, it's like where they have pretty old guard leadership and like a lot of
Yeah,
continuity there over the last 25 years, which is I think good in some ways, but it also caused them to sort of miss big opportunities to say like integrate the ground and air networks. Um, really any time in the last 20 years after they acquired RPS, uh, back in 2000
yeah.
time frame,
Well
somewhere
overdue
around
there.
then. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there are just some big obvious things that The world doesn't work like it did before, and I think if you look at sort of the logistics and how brands and companies think about logistics today is I think most people would agree that the world is more uncertain in the last 5 years than it has been 15 years ago, especially with the impacts of COVID and the bullwhip effect. And so stability creates every logistics professional, I don't care who they are. It's a cost
Right.
optimization game. You're trying to run more volume through a fixed asset to reduce your price per piece, end to end through that asset. That's great if things are stable. It's really bad if things are unstable because the way to optimize price per piece is to have a single supplier, is to invest in these big things that reuse over and over. And if there's any hiccups, then you're kind of out of
The
luck.
brittle supply
And
chain,
so
yeah.
exactly, and so your supply chain becomes very brittle. And so when China shuts off, you know, then what happens if you're someone like Peloton is now you start airlifting bikes in the United States at like 10 times the cost. So this this dichotomy between cost optimization and flexibility is sort of like an ever evolving challenge in logistics. And I think historically it's been like 80-20 rule, but in the favor of almost always it's price. You're going to go, I mean, if you're at FedEx 1 year and you're a customer for 5 years, then the next cycle, maybe you're going to go with UPS because they're going to beat their price. And that was the cycle for a generation. But having flexibility, the number of carriers in the United States has gotten more
Right.
diverse. Regional carriers trying to shorten the middle mile, zone skipping. There are a lot of strategies that, I mean, they existed for big players a long time ago, but now that those kinds of strategies have become more accessible to the small and medium businesses. And that I think requires some flexibility and the willing to use, I would say, like, best in breed carriers for different types of parcels, different types of customer requirements, etcetera.
And you just said it's more accessible to small players. What's changed between then and now that allows smaller players to diversify, to de-risk their supply chain?
It's crazy, but, like, I think technology has played a big part of it, and we've seen in the last 15 years just an explosion of supply chain technology firms. I'm gonna use one as an example. I know the CEO of Shipium, which has, like, a rate shopping solution. Jason Murray's an ex-Amazon guy who's the CEO there, and when a customer places an order, where is the best place to ship this from, and what carrier should I use to meet the customer's requirements or my profitability requirements? This has become much more standard software. And I would say, even when I started e-commerce in 2003, I used to work with a lot of eBay sellers, and they had a person
Right.
doing this. They would look at the order coming in, they would figure out where their warehouse is. Like, do I use UPS second day, or can I make it UPS ground and like make a little bit money on that and get it at the same time because I'm only 1 or 2 zones away, and that's just how it worked. Now there's too much volume to do that kind of sort of person by person optimization. And as a result, what's filled the gap is these essentially software solutions that make it easy to flip between one carrier and another rather than say like integrating only to the UPS solution or integrating only to the FedEx solution. And then if you want to switch to another carrier, like you have to reintegrate your website. Like no one does it that way anymore.
That's great.
Which I think that's progress for the
Yeah,
industry.
and I love the democratization effect that has. Going back, you talked Pareto that 80% of the focus was on cost reduction as opposed to, de-risk, diversification, etc. Um, Definitely saw the same effect and definitely saw the pandemic as turning light bulbs on that maybe we were a little too indexed in one direction. But my personal experience last 2 years or so has been that those lessons have been forgotten. Maybe that's a little too glib, but Are you seeing that? Do you feel like the pendulum swung again too far and the supply chains are becoming too brittle? Is that too broad a statement for most, all enterprise? Is there what do you see in that space?
It's interesting. I do think there are definitely folks that are kind of going back to, I don't say it's the bad old ways, but because it's what everyone grew up on. It worked while things are stable. Um, I think the world is becoming obviously more stable than COVID, and so people are hoping that that kind of continues, except for these events, maybe every now and then, which seems to be happening more frequently. I definitely do see some reversion to the mean a little bit. So things, if we went from 80-20 back to, let's say, 50-50, and we're kind of like trending back toward the 80, and hopefully we'll, maybe settle into like a 60-40, which might be a little bit more. But ultimately, logistics, because of the margin, it's such a low margin
Mm,
business that I think there's no hope for logistics to go back to like a 50-50, or going in the other direction. It's such a, like, if you talk to any chief logistics officer I've ever spoken with in the world, it's like it's a price conversation like
right,
90% of the time. And so ultimately, unless you're in some kind of existential event, or you're opening a new line of business, or you have a capability that you need to build that's maybe different, or there's a new market of customers, or I'm just gonna use an example with like Section 321 to like combat Temu or Shein, or like bringing goods in a certain way so that you can reduce your tariffs and get injecting items, different places in the United States. That's more of a structural trend, and that's more of a business initiative, unless
mm,
yeah, there's logistics involved, but you also need to change the way you do
yeah.
business to work that way.
And that to me ties into the hot trend of the immediate post-COVID era, which was reshore, nearshore, or even friendshore as a way to take uncertainty out of supply chain. So, do you see those as secular long-term things that are gonna continue as geopolitical risk seems to lessen? Or was that a flash in the pan as well? Like, what do you see? Are customers doubled down on it?
Yeah, look, I mean, the funny thing is anyone who tells you what's gonna be the long-term trend is probably lying to you, and so all we could do is read the tea leaves every few years and come up with a new forecast. But right now, it seems to me that the political winds are kind of going against, um, these foreign companies, like Chinese built companies taking advantage of low duty
Solar
imports,
especially, yeah,
and yeah, and dumping like billions of parcels a year into the United States. I don't It doesn't seem like that is gonna
gotcha.
continue. And so there will be nearshore advantages. Look, Mexico, the good news about like nearshoring to something like Mexico is like that's a great growth market. And so you have your if you have products landed there, you can use that for
Right,
that region. And a lot of the supply chain providers, including UPS, is connecting their logistics supply chain. They're creating an integrated supply chain for North America. They're not thinking about US separate than Mexico. And so I think you give yourself optionality in the event that, okay, I have some of this stuff in China and I'm going to use that in Europe. But the reality is, if something changes 5 years, you might need to change your approach. It's not as hard as it used to be to change your approach. And so, if you want to take advantage of a near-term opportunity that you see in the next 3 to 4 years, let's say with nearshoring, you could. It's not an irreversible
right.
decision. So that's the other great thing about some of these things. Like, there are service providers all over the world now that have experience doing these, and you you don't have to say, it's not like changing your company name, you know what I mean, or changing what products you're offering. You're just changing like where you land your inventory or what warehouse you put it into. And so ultimately, logistics, Amazon, like, just for its own sake, is trying to make logistics like Amazon Web Services. Like, Amazon Web Service has data centers all over the world. If you want to spin up a new compute cloud in Asia, do that. If you want to spin it up in the US, do that. And so these global logistics providers are trying to become the
Yeah.
same way. And so if you want to manufacture in India and China and Vietnam and Taiwan or Mexico and distribute it into different countries, they're making it easier to not make that sort of a one-way door that you have to walk through and can't expand from
Right.
that base.
Interesting. Yeah, the one-way versus two-way doors is an important way to think about it. It also ties into, like, time horizon on planning, and you're talking a lot about the what you do in your business is growth plans and long-term cycles. So, how do you think about planning cycles given there's tools and technology now that are reducing some of the cycle times? Are there multiple planning cycles that organizations are running that you're seeing it has it improved things or has it gotten too complex to manage?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends on what we're talking about
Mhm.
planning. Let's talk
Yeah.
about growth planning for a second. I mean, there's always like how do you hit the next quarter? How do you hit the year's targets? That's one horizon. And then the next horizon is usually like a 2 to 3 year horizon, which is like I can't realign my entire business, but I can make some pretty decent medium-sized bets to grow 10 to 20% or change this line of business. And it's then you have, I would say, like a 5 to 10
Mhm.
year horizon where it's like I could serve new customers, what new products I can come with. This is maybe your longer term innovation cycle that you can come up with. And so ultimately businesses are always planning on these sort of multiple sets of
Yeah.
cycles. And usually, I mean, usually on Wall Street, it seems like 100% of their plannings are spent trying to hit the quarters number. So there's that. But I think ultimately, let's say, 60% of the time they're focused on this quarter, this year. 30% of the time they're talking about the next 2 to 3 years. And then 10% of the time they're thinking 3, 5, 7 years down the line where you're not going to devote half of your day to something that's not going to happen 5 years from now because the world is crazy, right? It changes every
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, and tying that back to supply chain specifically, what I'm wondering on is given those kind of three tranches, maybe more planning cycles, are you seeing that any technology or any offering from these big providers is moving things that used to be in 5 to 10 year cycles into things that you can change? Because that's what you're talking about with the planned operations overseas. Is now you're not putting that name on it, and it's a one way door. You're locked into it. You can change your supply chain in shorter cycles.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Look, the I would say for a typical manufacturer, like let's even talk about before
Yeah.
e-commerce. Manufacture in China overseas, you put it on a boat, land it in the US, truck it to a distribution facility. Facility then goes out to your store customers to go into Walmart, Home Depot, wherever. This is like a year and a half from like concept creation of a product, to get to the manufacturer, and now it's finally in stores. Now you have, I mean, if you're somebody like a Shein, you're creating thousands of styles every week, and you don't ship them anywhere until the person hits the buy button. And so it's crazy. Those are both supply chain, and those are both things that have been enabled in the last 25 years, and a lot is, obviously very industry
Yeah.
specific, data specific. Um, but I would say the solutions, if you wanted to take advantage of I would say like a consumer driven manufacturing model, which is usually characterized by like more data and analytics and
Yeah.
trend focus, smaller batch and lot sizes, don't move it. Don't move product too much before you understand what the demand is. Ship it from overseas, as order and demand is creation, and then as you get more demand, then you can store it closer to the consumer because then you can optimize for speed and price, similar to what Amazon has been doing the past 15 years, so well that everyone knows and loves
Yeah.
with Prime. So I think Amazon has definitely be, I would say, the biggest force in North America in the last 20 years to really democratize supply chain. And they've really upped and they, I would say, frankly, taught retailers how to do supply chain the right way. And they've just taken it to like two or three levels above what the industry had typically been before Amazon got involved in the game, and has forced lots of other service providers to sort of up their game and say, like, you can have Amazon level service, but you can do it in this way through providers A, B, and C. You could outsource your warehousing. You can use supply chain planning software. Or you can even like, for instance, like last week, Dave Clark, the former logistics leader at Amazon, announced a new startup. What is he trying to do? He's trying to replicate all the stuff he did at Amazon for the rest of
Yeah.
everyone. And I think that's that's been an interesting trend to follow in supply chain from a software and service provider point of view, is like, what has Amazon created for the world that now everyone, we talked about even before in this conversation, what do small and medium businesses have access to? Some of those things started with Amazon. Not all of them, for sure, but
And now Amazon offering them directly to those SMBs, even for their non-Amazon channels of business. So such a huge brand and supply chain, and I'm using that term intentionally to get us into a dangerous place for supply chain, and that's brand. I know that's a focus area when you look at uncertainty and in planning these long-term cycles with your clients. So how should these companies be looking at brand uncertainty and supply chain as interconnected?
yeah. Look, in terms of your brand, ultimately, as you think about uncertainty, is what is your brand? It's essentially your customer's experience with you in the market. And so it involves not only the product that you're delivering to your customers that shows up in their doorstep, but the way they bought from you. How did they experience your product? How they made that decision? Where it was manufactured? How does it got to their doorstep? What notifications you sent them? So like the notion of a brand is itself. It's like obviously it's the name, but it's also the experience that the customer has. And so I always love kind of going back to Amazon for a second. um, Jeff Bezos always had this great framework that said you you can actually predict the future, and he had this interesting idea that, look, in 20 years, I have a pretty good idea that people are going to want things cheaper. They're going to want them faster, and so it's
Genius.
like it's a simple genius idea that so many businesses just forget, and that they know what's gonna drive sales, they know what customers want, but that they take the cheap and easy way out. It's like, "Oh, maybe I could just make a little bit more money on
Hmm.
shipping on this order," and they forget the things with, like, the conversion rate risk to that, or instead of putting the product closer to their customer in a facility that's maybe within the region, they're like, "Oh, it's much easier just to land it from China, put it all into one facility, and just ship all across the country from one facility." Even if it's like my facility's in California and 30% of my customers on the East Coast, they can wait a few more days. And never evaluate the business risk to your brand from that decision. And so I would say there's a huge brand implications from supply chain decisions that I would say the average marketer historically never appreciated. And I think Amazon really opened. The funny thing is, like, Amazon, everyone knows this intuitively just because of the Amazon experience that everyone has. But even today, how many websites do you go to that tell you, like, if you're on the product page, when are you going to get the product? Like, very few
And I
still.
go searching for it. I'm shocked to find so many like direct brand websites. Again, the term brand are at 7, 10 days.
Yeah, 5,
Right.
7 days, like, you don't know is the
Mhm.
reality. And then forget it, like, Christmas time, you need it in the next 3 days or something, and you call around, you go to their website, they said, "Oh, my store has it in stock, can I go pick it up?" And the website says, "Sure," and you call them on the phone, they're like, "No." And so that inventory position information is just not done well. And that creates a huge brand risk. Again, like this is supply chain too. I mean, supply chain is
Yeah.
math. It's really like having the product where your customer wants it in a way that they want it.
Exactly, and that's where it connected to for a lot of folks, where Amazon, Temu, Shein, like, those are brands built on their supply chains, right? That didn't exist prior to this century, so I think more people are aware of it post-COVID, but at the same time, some brands turn a blind eye. And I'm gonna go for another trigger word here based on my retail apparel background, which is inventories. Touched on it a bit, but I'm surprised it didn't get its own category header as an uncertainty and risk department is inventory.
Yeah, yeah, I'm surprised too. I think it was a huge miss on my part, which is like, especially in apparel and anything kind of trend based or um, that has long lead time or seasonal. Inventory kills businesses. Period. You either have too much of it or you have too
Yeah,
little
and
of it.
that's the underside to uncertainty, right? We keep equating it to risk, but uncertainties to the positive too. What if your business blows up? What if everybody's into your product? What then?
Yeah, what then? And what then if you don't have extra capacity, which again, extra capacity, overproduction, it costs money. And I would say rare is the planner who anticipates excess demand and says like, "Oh, we're gonna go to this backup supplier." Usually, you're just caught
Mhm.
flat-footed. And so the reality is COVID has produced this great unwinding of inventory in that there was a lot of excess production during COVID because of this excess command. There was excess demand. There was a lot of money sloshing around the economy, still low interest rates. Everyone was at home, especially in e-commerce. People were buying as much as possible. And so since COVID, what's happened to supply chain? Like demand has slacked off. There's excess capacity in supply chains, like there's excess warehouse space. Carriers have capacity. FedEx and UPS have both been closing facilities. And so we're in a little bit of an overcapacity setting here. And that's been true of inventory as well. And so if you look at like Walmart, if you look at Target, if you look at Macy's, every year in the past 2 years, every earnings call talks about their
Right.
inventory levels, and they're all less, almost all of them, every year is less than the next year. Um, this year was the first year that I saw Walmart, increase their inventory level slightly, but since, like, 2021, 2022, 2023 was, like, drastically
Hmm.
dropped as sort of demand, um, kinda dropped off there, and, we realized that as interest rates kind of rose, consumer demand slacked off, and as a result, we can't produce as much. We need to
Yeah.
chase demand rather than kind of lead
So
demand.
so love all that. A lot of it's cyclical. You mentioned these cycles. So is there anything in the space of inventory and uncertainty that you've learned that businesses have learned in the last 5 years that's going to hold true as we go into 2025?
Yeah, I think 2025, what I believe is we're entering, you know, we kind of went from the age of growth kind of before COVID and through COVID. As we exited COVID, say it's like middle of 2022 into early 2023, we kind of switch over into profitability. Like we can't grow at all costs anymore. We need to be profitable.
Mhm.
If we can't be profitable, we're gonna die. And we've kind of moved, I would say, into this year and into next year into what we're calling the age of efficiency here at RMW Commerce, which is means you have cash, you turn that cash into inventory, and then you need to turn that inventory into sales. And how many times per year that you can turn that inventory in sales will determine how efficient your business is from a cash flow point of view. And so that age of efficiency, I think in 2025 is part of the age of efficiency is like optimizing your business for success, meaning like how do you ensure that you don't have excess waste? Are you prepared for multiple scenarios like if interest rates stay high for longer than we expect, or if they keep decreasing? That's two scenarios right there. If we have a trade war with China, that's another scenario right there. If the consumer continues to feel stressed, that's another scenario right there. If the consumer starts feeling, and so I think cyclically in 2025, you're going to I think if there's something we can count on, I don't see anything that's gonna reverse sort of like the stress consumers are feeling. It kinda I don't know about you, but it feels to me like grocery prices have never really
Right.
come down. I spend like $100 at the grocery store, and I'm like, "I just got breakfast." Like, I didn't like, what else did I g what else did I get here? I used to feel like my money was it got a lot further, and so what happens when your essentials get more expensive, like housing or real estate or childcare and grocery items, it leaves less money for discretionary expenses. And you spend more time with experiences and friends and family. And so I think consumer stress will continue, uh, clear into 2025, almost regardless of the election cycle. That's something that we're going to be able to count on.
What would be your big crazy prediction for supply chain and logistics 3 years? We're ending what 2027 at that point, coming into 2028.
Yeah, I think the biggest prediction for supply chain and logistics is that everyone will manufacture in multiple places around the world and have multiple points of distribution. So I think it will be much more common than it is today for the average brand to be in this kind of multi-source, multi-distribution world than we have it today, than choosing a single supplier for everything.
Love that prediction. Great. I hope it comes true as well. So you touched on
Yeah.
AI near the start, and we didn't really get much into like applications of it. So this doesn't have to be related to uncertainty. It's just broad AI application. What are you
hmm
seeing as the best immediate application in your space, and what about the most long term impact?
Yeah, I mean, the shortest path AI is usually in some kind of planning or route optimization or inventory placement optimization. Obviously, we've been doing this in the industry for forever. AI essentially just makes those predictions smarter. So it's kind of a low hanging fruit way to continue improving those predictions.
Yeah.
What what to put where you can improve more variables. I think supply chain part of supply chain is frankly your customer service, and so it seems like the idea of a talking to a real live human customer service agent is going to go the way of the dodo. And so it that definitely seems to be happening, particularly with generative AI. That's something you couldn't have predicted 4 years ago for sure. Um, and I think the most long term impact of I think really is what's the biggest risk to logistics over the long term? It's people.
Hmm.
And so, ultimately, the idea behind AI is to remove humans from the loop in every decision, in every contingency, in every inside of facilities, so that automation can take over more things. And obviously, that doesn't work for every scenario. They have to be sort of things that are well understood. But I think AI is going to keep pushing the boundary of scenarios that are kind of within its realm of control. And I mean, we probably both agree that the things that AI can do even now, 2 years ago, none of us predicted ChatGPT and all this stuff that's already come up. And it seems like we're in this situation where every 6 months something kind of amazing comes out of the AI world. And to predict that forward, you can almost not over predict what's going to happen, which you may end up overshooting there. But I think that's where it could be going.
It's exciting. I'm great on almost all. I'm definitely hoping against the chatbot.
It's a little scary for people, to be honest with you.
Yeah. No, and warehousing logistics has been through that with robotics for years, and I think the finding
Yeah.
has been that like one in robotics to take away the dirtiest, least human friendly jobs.
Right.
And
Right.
two, it's allowed the jobs that do exist within those operations to up level.
Yeah.
So, hopefully we
Yeah,
get
so
rid of.
so those jobs become more white collar, and less humans doing repetitive motion, again, kinda
20-hour,
going back.
20-mile walks in an Amazon facility
Exactly.
over the course of a day, yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, keep the people in
Mhm.
place, let the robots move the boxes around.
Alright, this one has been interesting this season. So, the
Yeah.
craziest, most interesting thing that you've seen out in the field in your career. So, I can bring examples, a
Uh,
couple folks didn't know where I wanted to go with this, and I don't have a particular where place to go, it's more,
wow, that's so funny. I mean, I think sometimes you find very interesting product in warehouses that's not kind of like, as seen on TV, or, you know, facilities that, products that you can only find in late nights, people selling like sex toys out of the warehouse, and like you just find like in logistics, you never know what you're gonna run across down the next aisle. And it's just sometimes just hilarious when the customer is like, this is something they see every day, and you're walking this it's like, whoa, I didn't expect to see that down the aisle. And so that I think that's gonna be funny
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah. Well, great. I'm glad we got you on the hook with some predictions for 2025 before we signed off.
Yeah, you're gonna replay this at the end of the year next year, and laugh at me. I'm pretty sure.
Well, you should see what we've got from some of the guests, the audacious predictions. But Rick, this conversation I could have gone for another hour or two. It's so good hearing your thoughts on the industry, on uncertainty and risk specifically. And yeah, thank you. Hope to talk to you again soon here.
All right, I appreciate your time, Ben, and looking forward to being back here in the future.